Hello and welcome to Radical Engagement. And while we're going to continue our series, I'm giving us a little break with some short pieces. The series on militancy, the higher form of alienation, will start soon, and we will continue our series on Bordiga. But let's go into Paul Sutherland's LARP politics and hyperreality today, which is kind of a discussion that comes up a lot. I talk a lot about the implications of playing out the past and how when we use the insult of LARPing, it's actually a way of talking about that. But there is a way in which these politics are fictitious, or at least semi-fictitious, and we have to deal with that. So we read Paul Sutherland's LARP Politics and Hyperreality from the public part of the Substack Do Not Research. I will link it in the show notes. All right, let's get going. We start off with a long quote from Reddit, so I'm going to read that. Just know that this is a quote from Reddit for those of you who are listening on the Patreon channel. Political LARPing and communism. So this is not the article, this is the quote. So I think we're all aware that once you get into a certain area of political ideology, you start to notice that every ideology has people deemed LARPers. They aren't actual live action role players. It's an expression used for people who like to imagine themselves as this perfect political aesthetic that they dream of, even if they aren't part of a political group. For example, libertarians often imagine themselves as the self-made Jeffersonians, or alt-righters as traditional German crusaders for nationalism. However, I've never seen any bigger LARPers than those on the far left. No matter where you land, Stalinist or anarchist, a much higher amount of communists have this grand illusion of being the abused worker, toiling for the bourgeoisie in the brutal factories for nothing but scrap, when in reality the vast majority of these people work in either office work or most likely retail. I mean, I get retail is a hard enough job, but it requires very little skill, little to no physical labor, and it often has a net negative on society. Why do you folks think this is? Is there a reason communism gets much more LARP than other ideologies? What are the other ideologies have to say the most LARPers? And if any Reds are lurking, feel free to talk about this, as perhaps there is something that I didn't acknowledge that makes me sound like I'm exaggerating. Well, I mean, I'm just going to say, like, the idea that the industrial proletariat was the only proletariat that mattered was a second international mistake. So, and a lot of production has a net negative effect on society. So again, there's some flawed assumptions in there, but I still think the basic thrust of that fits. Like, people have the imaginary of the perfect worker. That perfect worker largely does not exist. It's a collective imaginary. I mean, there's a whole, I think, a slightly incorrect view coming out of EndNotes Volume 4 in the History of Separation essay that pretends that was always fake. I don't think it was always fake, but I do think it was maybe over relied upon and over justified for what communists thought their base was. I mean, it is what triggered the first revisionist controversy between Bernstein and Kotsky. All right, back to the article. This is the actual text of the article now, not the text of a Reddit subreddit post. All right. LARP refers to live action role playing. Yep, used to do it in my teens as a way to stay off the streets. A genre of role playing game where a fictitious world with its own lore and internal logic is mutually agreed upon by multiple players. Each of these players sets out as a character within this world, and though they're characters, engages in a dialogue with one another. Perhaps some archetypal example of LARPing describes some sort of historical reenactment, which would find at a medieval fair, good old Ren Fair, and Society for Creative Anachronism was something like the first LARP I ever saw. But the first LARP I participated in was all those golf vampire LARPs in the late 90s. So, there you go. But the terms have become increasingly used with increasing frequently to describe people's relationship to extreme political alignments. I think we don't describe regular political alignments in terms of LARPing enough, quite frankly. But nonetheless, yes, And I think one of the interesting things about LARP today is I hear LARPing more referred to as a critique of politics. And honestly, we should be really fair. It's more like a massive online role-playing game at this point, like an MMORPG, than it is even a LARP. Because a lot of people are only doing this in certain kinds of personas. When people talk about like neo-Marxist Leninism, neo-Stalinism, a lot of those people aren't in groups. They're just annoying people on Twitter. Now there are. I'm not gonna say it doesn't translate to groups at all. It's not true. There's a whole like YouTube genre now around this, but I think it's interesting what the LARP critique actually says, particularly when you tie it into all the parasocial relations involved. Now, what I think is interesting is this reader, Paul Sutherland, actually notices the same thing I do, that the 18th premiere of Louis Bonaparte predicts this. So, right. This essay is an inquiry into why LARP has become resonant for understanding the aesthetics of specific political and cultural phenomenon in the 20th century. Cool. After farce, Marx's famous introduction to the 18th premiere of Louis Bonaparte, that history happens thrice versus tragedies and as farce, has become something of a leitmotif in the work of artists, cultural critics, and journalists grappling with the absurd elements of political agitation in the 21st century. Notably, Hal Foster poses the question, what comes after farce, in his 2020 book of the same name, a book cataloging the contemporary art responses to existence in the Trump era. However, with the renewed appeal and with support from various textual and visual examples, a new addendum has emerged. LARP comes after farce, but it also comes before farce. Okay. Friend of the show, Andy's mentioned in here a lot, so we'll get into that. The notion of that LARP historically emerges after farce is encapsulated in a quote found by A.M. Giblitz, aka Andy of Antifada, biography of Humero Cristalli, better known as J. Posadas. Long quote from Andy. What we on the left flatter ourselves in calling our political and even revolutionary work is in fact nothing of the sort. It is akin to a religious ritual. Mass rallies, newspaper sales, endless meetings, electoral campaigns, street fightings, writing articles that no one will ever read, and books that absolutely no one will ever get any practical use out of. At another time, in another place, these rituals may have had a relationship to a broader movement, a broader strategy, and that such stirrings have always accompanied revolutionary movements. And so, having no real conception of the thing itself, we grasp at revolution by playing out its inessential weirdness ad nauseum. This is what comes after farce. This is LARP. This is a quote from Comrade Communicator, the incumbent leader of the Intergalactic Workers' League, Posadist IWLP. The IWLP is a predominantly online collective situated somewhere between political organization and a meme page, and they are some of the contemporary torchbearers for the legacy passed down from J. Posadas. Posadas was an Argentinian revolutionary whose chief conviction was to advocate for nuclear war as a tool of communist acceleration. I mean, it's even weirder than that. And I would also say he was a chief Trotskyist revolutionary. That's also kind of important. A further influential legacy of his political ideology was the conviction that if advanced extraterrestrial life forms exist, they must have already reached communism, as it provides the only path for organizing production towards technological level necessary for interstellar travel. It's evident from this quote that Comrade Communicator is acutely aware of the arbitrariness and absurdity of deciding to be a Posadist in the 21st century. LARP here refers to playing out political actions empty of their capacity to materially advance an emancipatory project. And without these broader material goals, what's stopping you from being a Posadist? And this is a good question for me. What I found interesting is the Posada stuff, as a meme, grew before Bernie and kind of peaked right before Bernie too, the second Bernie campaign. And what I find interesting is that at that moment, it didn't look like we were back in LARP mode. I mean, we kind of ultimately were, but of course, now that we're back there, no one wants to point that out again. We're back in the LARP that knows no name, because people don't want to believe that their focus solely on mediation doesn't go anywhere. And I'm not saying that there's some imminent world on which we can build communism that just exists out there. You kind of have to make it, but I do think it's kind of funny that that's where you end up. LARP is not exclusively used to describe left-wing revolutionary politics. In her exhibition entitled First as Tragedy, Then as LARP, Tommy Felsen riffs on the same theme to draw attention to the rioters storming the Capitol on Jan 6, 2021. I thought that too. I actually thought that one of the things about that is, like, as an insurrection, it was kind of a joke. I know that a lot of insurrections start off as a joke and end up real, so don't come at me about that, but I still think it was kind of a joke. All right, for Faison, this turn of phrase was helpful to describe the fact that these rioters, after successfully breaching the Capitol building, were forced to come to terms with their complete inability to do anything revolutionary after the fact. Insurrection becomes reduced to the banal vandalism and bizarre photo ops. RFL puts it, they were only able to generate images. And there's some truth to that. And a lot of those images landed a few of those people in jail. So, what a fun LARP it actually ends up being. A LARP with real consequences, but not the ones you wanted. All right. Many contemporary movements and organizations across the political, ideological, and spiritual spectrum still sustain membership, often composed of those that appear to be deeply passionate about their chosen cause. This is what I talk about when I talk about politics as identity as opposed to politics as politics. Politics is always part of an identity for people who think that I'm being unfair there. It's just that tends to be all that it is right now. All right. This sits in tension with the deeply held belief that under neoliberal capitalism, things will not change. Oh, yes. Good old Fisher, a la Jameson, a la somebody at Jameson was probably ripping off. I can't remember. I get very frustrated. We always attribute it to Fisher and Capitalist Realism, a book now that's almost 15 years old. That is a gloss really on a Jameson argument. The seeming incapacity to realize that a political project beyond neoliberal capitalism is aptly described by Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism. Fisher argues that any desire for systemic change in the world is placated by living vicariously through fantasy representations of people enacting these changes for themselves. Yes. That's why there's so many anti-capitalist movies that make money. I mean, the irony isn't lost on anybody. Right-wingers have been talking about this forever, but there's a fundamental truth there, like that turning revolutionary change into a movie is a way to sell that back at you as a dream or a spectacle, as a fever dream. And I kind of wish DeBoer had actually fleshed out the spectacle theoretically a lot more. That book is not particularly theoretically rigorous, and so people throw it around as if it can mean anything, even though today it's not actually very accurate. For one thing, the spectacle for DeBoer was modeled in the media of mid-century television, not 20th century social media, where you are part of the spectacle directly, not just a passive consumer of it. And I don't know why people haven't made something about that being a contributor to LARP, because now you can actually engage in the revolutionary cosplaying, not just passively consume it on television. All right. Fisher argues that capital will always find a way to co-opt revolutionary desire and sell it back to you, often defined it in a harmless form. I mean, so did Christopher Lash in Cultural Narcissism. So did Heath and somebody, I can't remember. It's Heath and Andrew Potter and the Rebel Cell. Sorry, I had to check that out. I read that book about actually before the Capitalist Realist book came out, so I guess it was almost 20 years ago. And I forgot its title, so you guys just saw me look it up. The Rebel Cell. It's not new. To illustrate this point, consider the example of the merchandising of Che Guevara images on T-shirts, the Guy Fawkes mask, or even the Hunger Games of Black Panther movies. Ironically, and I'm very serious about this, Fisher, during his Politics of Joy period, was celebrating those kinds of movies. He was particularly fond of the Hunger Games, which I always found ironic because, like, that's actually what capitalist realism is kind of about. One day I should write a book on the many antinomies of Mark Fisher. Nonetheless, Dale Baran, in It Came From Something Awful, argues that by being surrounded by this co-option of political aspirations by capital, we are left with the sense that our own subjectivity has been reduced to being a consumer. That's an old argument. It's one I've seen since the 1950s, but okay. So that's true even back under the Fordism that a lot of social democrats want back, even though it's not really what their politics would naturally indicate. Therefore, we find ourselves able to ask of our political imagery is that we have media representations available for our consumptions that reinforce and signify our political ideas and display our revolutionary identity brand. For those of you who are listening, I got a picture of a Guy Fawkes mask on Australian, looks like eBay. All right. A major consequence of the phenomenon described by Fisher and Baran is that revolutionary politics beyond neoliberal capitalism evolved into a politics being adopted as a personal style and performed regardless of their efficacy. And this is a big, this is Varn talking, this is a big thing for me. I'm constantly arguing with people about efficacy of political movements and people achieving what they set out to achieve. And when they don't, I'm often told that the stated goals wasn't the goal in the first place. Now, I do think that that's also beyond just this LARP thing. That's also a way to preserve prior investments. But there's something in it. I mean, in some ways, the entire politics of David Graeber was all about embracing that as a good thing, which doesn't make a lot of sense. All right. In The Trump Effect in Contemporary Art and Visual Culture, Kit Messaham Moore and Euros Corvo pinpoint the historical context for this political moment. They attribute it to the political conditions that emerge in the 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, described by Francis Fukuyama as the end of history, wherein technocratic, liberal, democratic, free market economics will become the inevitable end state of human organization. I mean, nothing's the inevitable end state of human organization, but yeah. Rather than the post-ideological neoliberalism becoming the uncontested structure of the New World Order, however, Massaham, Moore, and Coverto describe the current period as defined by embodied experimentalist, regionalist, biological, biopolitical identitarianism, aka it's all woke now, including anti-wokeness. You heard me. I said it. All right. Here, much of the politics becomes attached to, induced to self-expression through images and condemnation of your enemies through those images, and that's pretty much it. That's what people's politics are. It's positive identification with some ideal that you're not even trying to embody, and negative identification with people you dislike. That's positive aesthetics, negative partisanship. That's what motivates most people. And in fact, I think that actually motivates a lot of mainstream politics too, which is something I kind of wish people would explore more. The condition where widespread dissatisfaction with neoliberalism is met with the performance of politics for its aesthetic value and the consumption within a wider capitalist framework is a condition where political agitation performatively gesturing towards revolution is described as LARP. Yeah, duh. It's so interesting to me as a concurrent development. I started commenting on politics as LARP around 2009, 2010, during the some of the beginnings of what was going to become street protests in the Obama years. But I also think it's interesting that we reach for this metaphor because LARP itself is kind of a weird development. I mean, yeah, you have like Civil War reenactors and Ren Fair people and the Society for Creative Anachronism, but then when you started having like LARP D&D and LARP Vampire the Masquerade and whatnot, as a way of like mediating play for high schoolers and adults, basically. The fact that we describe our politics this way does say something. I mean, some of it's very limited to the time period. Like a lot of the things that we're talking about in LARP politics also exist in the 70s, but there's no LARP as a model for describing it. We don't describe the Weathermen like completely ineffective terror campaign as a LARP that was dangerous and blew some of their own members up. But that's kind of what it was. All right. Describing political agitation of LARP suggests a more complicated relationship between image and reality than simply to decry these political agitations are naive and disconnected. Yep, I actually do think there's some deeper implications there than just that these are naive. Indicating a deeper and more considered set of logistics and motivations. I argue that the complicated relationship between image and reality suggested by the phrase LARP comes after farce can be understood by examining Baudrillard's notion of simulation and hyperreality, as opposed to Echo's notion of simulation and hyperreality. All right. This is a picture of Greg Guevara. Greg Guevara, also known as J-Reg, runs a YouTube channel which sometimes involves LARPing as an embodiment of a string of political ideologies. In 2022, he ran as mayor of Baudrillard as a self-described anti-centrist platform. Baudrillard published a Precession of Simulacra in 1981 to address the impact of mass media had on the subject experience of the world. Rapid development in digital technology during this period enabled society to be saturated with photography, advertising, and visual images. Yes, although this was talked about as early as Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by good old Walter Benjamin, like, I don't know, 60 years before this. So wasn't new. All right. But the technologies had developed and Baudrillard was on that trail. Baudrillard's writing about media technologies is good, except when he tries to say that it undoes all the logic of capital, which it absolutely does not. And he was declaring this at the time, and people have defended him for declaring this at the time in like 2003, when it was beginning to be obvious that you were having the return of business cycle logics. And people were like, oh, he couldn't have seen 2007. I don't know. I saw it as early as 2005, but also there have been a bubble burst already in the dot-coms in the late 90s and early aughts anyway, which was a precursor to what's going to happen in the housing market. So maybe people who talk about political economy should be following this stuff. The machines don't change the logic because the machines are still coded by people. Okay, good. Now we understand that. You can get this weird idea that machines do their own thinking out of your head. For Baudrillard, this meant a radical shift that would occur between the late 19th and late 20th century in terms of what objects their value, what gave objects their value under capitalism. For the masses, objects became valued and desired primarily in terms of image or aesthetic rather than utilitarian function. I mean, has anyone ever read Velvet? They were valued for image and aesthetic even in the 19th century. This is a distinction that I've found that Baudrillard just posits a harder break between the 19th and 20th century than there actually is. Those logics already existed. They were already there. All right. The rise of commodity fetishism and the dominance of the image saturation informed Baudrillard's claim that there could be no real commodity fetishism. Doesn't mean in Marx what Baudrillard uses it to mean. And this is one of these things I get very frustrated with post-Marxists because they use a lot of Marxist terms decontextually on purpose in ways that confuse actually understanding Marx. Nonetheless, the rise of the commodity fetishism and dominance of the image informed Baudrillard's claim that the real could no longer be directly accessed because it went entirely obfuscated by simulacra. Asterisk. The real could never be directly accessed, at least not articulated in a way. This is the romanticism of Baudrillard that I think no one points out. They're like, oh, Baudrillard's this cold. No, he actually does believe there's some imminent world in which you can know, and talk about. I believe that you may be able to know it, but you ain't talking about it, right? The moment you have to mediate it, it's no longer an imminent experience. So there you go. Epitomizing the 21st century as the emergence of parasocial relationships in the sense that the interaction between people online are more acutely interactions between other people's images of themselves. Oh, I skipped a bit. The rise of the could claim that no longer directly accessed, but is tightly obfuscated by simulacra. Instead, we only access the simulation of the real. To steal man Baudrillard's claim a little bit, I think there is a sense in which we interact with more and more layers of mediation. So that's where the simulation of the real has a rational kernel of truth. But you're still interaction with the real somewhere. There's a way in which, the Baudrillardian ephemera of technology just assumes that all this stuff doesn't have physical infrastructure you have to maintain and all that. I mean, there's a way in which that's bracketed out in a way that's very distorting. Anyway, epitomizing this 21st century and the emergence of parasocial relationships and the sense of interactions between people online being more acutely interactions between others' images of themselves. I mean, the difference between character and authenticity is actually somewhat important. This is one point made by Byung-Chul Han that I think he under-theorized, but he's fundamentally correct about, that the collapse of those two things actually hollows out the self. So having to perform authenticity, which is something you see constantly on visual social media, leads to it not meaning much of anything. The procession of psychoanalysis belongs squarely within the category of postmodernist thought, which, according to Frederick Jameson, seemed to be inclined towards inverted millenarianism, theorizing the passive sense of the imminent end of everything and the replacement of the depths of authenticity, essence of signification with the flatness and superficiality of appearance, aka that form of postmodernism is actually guilty of what it is critiquing. And that was Jameson's critique. And I think Jameson was kind of right about that for all of Jameson's own limitations. The sense that this theory had reached its logical conclusion for cultural analysis gave way for Andreas Husson to regard it with suspicion. He criticized it as cynical and unhelpful for the way in which it precluded any attempt to understand media representation according to their ideological functions. Yep, agree with that. Arguably, the decades following proved this not to be the case. Well, arguably, you better argue it. Rather, I argue, in ways in which media represents ideological simplification has become more extraordinarily abstract, superficial, and protean. I would still agree with that, but that's different from saying media representation has no ideological functions. It definitely does. Right. In spite of the allegation of cynicism, Baudrillard's theory of simulation proved to be remarkably prescient, providing an effective framework for understanding the cultural impact and the function of the internet as a virtual world. Yes. But the internet is literally a simulation. Okay. The utility of returning to Baudrillard today is not because he produced any kind of end of theory, but because in the 40 years since theorizing the supremacy of appearance and the image, the way in which we understand culture, appearance, and image has been re-imbued with complex signification and depth of meaning. Yep, I agree with that. The advent of meme culture, for example, demonstrates the vernacular and communicative function of images, which bear no indexical relationship to the dense meaning they convey. I mean, yeah, with memes, you're dealing with meta irony and hybrid discourses and whatnot. It's actually a whole lot's in memes, and I've been mad that we don't teach kids meme literacy, right? And yet are understood and disseminated by people on an almost first language basis. Yep. I will return to the relationship between the internet and simulation later on, but this relationship is central towards understanding the resonance of LARP as a descriptor of political action. LARP and hyperreality. Okay, let's get to this. LARP implies the dual existence of the world of images and the world of the real. Yeah, but it actually also implies that the world of images is enacted in the real world. That's the live action part. The world of images is self-contained, self-referential, and cognitively separate from the world of the real upon which it is overlaid. Yeah, that's a misunderstanding of semiotics. Yeah, I think that assertion is like kind of wrong. It is not cognitively separate from the world of the real, which is overlaid. It is cognitively emergent from that world. In order to LARP, one must physically participate in the world of the real and cognitively engage in the world of images. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So that dual nature is noted. Finally, LARP also implies a specific mode of engaging with the image world distinct from the mere spectatorship. LARP is active, not passive. Bingo. That's why we have to talk about this. But we should also be clear that LARP, in the terms of internet aesthetics, is actually not quite a LARP, and so that duality needs to be noted too. It places the LARPer in the dual position of actor and spectator to the image world. Bingo. So aside from my disagreement on the metaphysics of what, and by the way, that is a metaphysical claim that the real and images are completely separate. I think the LARP is actually interesting because it indicates that they're not completely separate. And that's my critique of Baudrillard, is he kind of presupposes an imminent world that technology is the only thing mediating, and our media technology is the primary thing mediating it, and language mediates the world already. Signs they signify, and semiotics in general mediate the world. Pragmatics mediate the world, and the Charles Sanders Peirce sense. All right. The person who LARPs creates their own alternate reality, and importantly, is aware that it's ultimately just a fantasy. Yes. The dual, creates their own, acting as if they're in an alternate reality. I mean, the reality of that alternate reality is actually paradoxically culminated in the fact that everyone's aware that it's not really an alternate reality. It's really a fantasy production. The dual interface with the world of images and the world of the real allows us to consider LARP in terms of Baudrillard's concept of simulation. This is actually a good use of Baudrillard's concept for all my critiques earlier. I think this is fair. For Baudrillard, a simulation is a mimicry which presents the difference between the real and the imaginary. A simulation, in every sense, operates in the world of images. Its internal reference bears no relation to reality, only to other images. Consider the medieval fair. Ren Fair, for those of us here. People parade as knights in chainmail, as jesters are as paupers, walk in and out of carnival marquees, and sell each other a variety of handicraft wares. The aesthetics expectation from going to a medieval fair, Ren Fair in America, is not that it accurately resembles medieval Europe, the aesthetics of which can only be comprehended in terms of an imaginary based on stereotypes and mythology, but is that it resembles every other medieval fair that you've been to. Yep. Yeah. This is what hyperreality refers to. And Umberto Eco's Travels in Hyperreality talks about this in Disney World. I think people should read that book. I think it's actually a little bit more approachable than Baudrillard's. It's one of my favorite books. Anyway, nonetheless, LARPing, like any simulation, also requires interfacing with the real at some point. At the medieval fair, LARPers will don capes and joust with wooden poles. The jousting may belong to the world of images, but the physical consequences of such actions are very real. You can break your ribs. That's why I'm talking. Also, you participate in real commodity production to manufacture the images in a Ren fair, which is different from internet aesthetics. And I do think we need to keep pointing that out. All right. If we consider through this the lens that reworked Marxian adage central to the essay, LARP comes after farce, we can infer two things. Firstly, we understand that the political agitation within its scope exists as a repetition and emulation of a prior political agitation. Okay, so that's what I thought I was going to go to with the Brumaire. That's actually indicated in the Brumaire. The Brumaire talks about this in both the English, basically LARPing the Bible, and the French LARPing the Roman Republic. And yeah, they were effectively LARPing. They were adopting the coat of, the coat of the habak, is the way Marx refers to it. Literally taking the symbols of these prior things until, John Locke comes around and you don't need them anymore. All right. We consider repetition to be analogous to mimicry, reenactment, or copy. I mean, we really should talk about it as poor mimesis, but that's just here. That's just me talking here. Mimesis means the copying of something to embody it. All right. Secondly, we infer that it describes a political agitation situated in the world of images. The repetition of the event is a twofold operation. It operates materially via its interface with the real, and it operates symbolically via its interface with prior iterations of itself, its reference. Yep. So these aesthetics are self-referential over time. For the repetition to be described as farcical, its purchase on the real is humorously undermined by its failure to convey the gravity of its precedent. However, describing a repetition as LARP denotes another layer of abstraction. Yes, it does. This is actually a smart reading. I'm going to give Sutherland this. It denotes a repetition which can only ever be reproduced its precedent symbolically, and whose interface with the real is experienced as jarring and inadvertent. So we all LARP in the beginning of politics, but after the farce, LARP is just what's left. All right. Live action role playing suggests this third repetition is no longer situated in the real at all. It belongs to the imagined realm of simulation and is made the possible by the social conditions of hyperreality. Maybe. I think we're going to have to parse this out. Hyperreality for Baudrillard describes a condition of late modernity where simulacra has become so pervasive in our everyday experience that the boundary between the image and reality has become pointless to distinguish. I don't think pointless, but hard, definitely. And this is even more true now than when Baudrillard was writing it in the 80s. Without a clear distinction between the real and the imaginary, simulations seem to be able to convey more meaning than the banal real itself. The simulation is truer than reality, more pressing, more accurate. Art brighter. It's not truer than reality, but nonetheless, the subjective experience of the hyperreal requires an implicit understanding of the evocative, connotative, and affective functions of the phenomenon we interact with. Yep. And this implicit understanding is shared by people around us. In the hyperreal world, images become vernacular and communicative, and self-identity becomes something you perform by publicly and deliberately affiliating with certain images and adopting certain aesthetic signifiers. My only critique about this is always true. Aesthetic signifiers are why sumptuary laws existed in medieval Europe. A sumptuary law is a law about what clothing you can wear because it indicates your station, social function, and relations to others. All right. Performativity, a concept Judith Butler uses to describe gender identity as an appearance of substance for mundane social audiences, is the default mode of engagement with the hyperreal world. Yes. It is not merely gender that is constructed by images, but all aspects of identity. I would just say always has been. All right. If you are navigating hyperreality, means inevitably performing and signaling your identity within your aesthetic and behavioral decisions. It might seem, therefore, that a LARP can be explained as synonymous to performativity, but this is not the case. The utility of the term LARP is more specific, since especially describing a political phenomenon. One might performatively demonstrate their gender identity, wealth status, or political allegiance, aka Velbian consumption, conspiracious consumption, and status consumption, is the real thing and exist way before LARP politics. It's actually part of status politics in general, which even predates capitalism. But to LARP as any one of these things requires an admission that what one LARPs is not fundamentally connected to their self-identity. Ooh, that's an interesting thing. Like the knights, jesters, and paupers at a medieval fair, these identities stop existing as soon as the LARPers take off the costume. The eBay bought camo uniform, the Che Guevara beret, the bespoke AR-15, the Hawaiian t-shirt. And I think this is precisely how LARP is used in the phrase LARP comes after farce. My only thing is all this stuff is not new. People donning such costume that signifies in a limited way is actually part of how human signification and symbolic mediation works in general. It's not specifically modern. The scale of it is modern, and as I've said many times, the scale of something does change its nature. So maybe that's where LARP comes in. LARP politics are politics with low stakes buy-in that one can just put on like a costume just to see if it fits. Absolutely. And we see this with teenagers, the way teenagers used to wear musical genres. Justin Satilla's game, if you see my gaming materialist thing with, you can find it on this channel or on TIR because it's a TIR co-production with Justin Santilla on his class politics game. He actually comments that like high schoolers do this now. They'll even have several different identities based on different profiles they have on social media. LARP politics are politics with low stakes that we can buy them like a costume and just to see if it fits. LARP politics are politics which are not fundamentally connected to self-identity because an underlying belief that they aren't real and can't affect change. So a lot of people both, I think, have a schizophrenic idea when they're calling everyone else LARPers but not themselves, is that it is flattering. All right. And this is what led me to stop using the terminology because I if everyone is LARPing, then almost nobody is. All right. Furthermore, LARPing as a phenomenon belonging to Baudrillard's third order of the image serves to reinforce the otherwise porous boundary between image and reality. As a mode of engagement in hyperreality, LARPing is a simulation that masks the absence of the real. To declare that something is LARP is to uphold position that the boundary between image and reality still exists. Yep. This provides a helpful clues towards the understanding of the aesthetics of LARP politics. Hyperreality describes an ambiguity between image and reality. Yes. However, the image seems more real than the real. Yeah, that's what hyperreality actually implies. However, the dialectic between the two still remains culturally understood, and some things are perceived to belong to one camp or another. I would argue in the hyperreal world of the 20th century, image and reality have become analogous to online and offline. We have other synonyms that can reinforce this dialectic, such as virtual reality, metaverse, cyberspace, compared to IRL, meet space, and physical. Online phenomena are regarded as belonging to the order of image by the virtue of requiring screens to interact with them. Yeah, although there's a whole physicalist infrastructure this ignores, as I've talked a lot about. Offline phenomena are required to belong to the order of the real, as interactions between them are physical and tactile. And reversely, there's also a whole symbolic mediation order in the physical and tactile world that we also aren't dealing with either. So it's almost like the yin yang single where one has the whole in the other. Of course, this distinction is artificial. Thank you. Good job, Paul. Much of this work is done by affect theorists over the past 30 years, demonstrates how interactions with images can elicit visual and even palpable psychological responses. Absolutely. Additionally, and of course, central to Baudrillard's notion of hyperreality, our experience of the off-world world is understood via mediation of images. Thank you. And words. I would actually say via mediation of symbols in general. All right, mediation is a symbolic order. Okay. Much like the distinction between LARP and hyperreality, the cultural distinction between online and offline is a function of the hyperreality that masks the absence of the real. As described earlier in this piece, the political context of the 20th century is that politics are structured and understood according to their aesthetic features and their effective value. Yep. For politics to be adopted as and reduced to personal style makes sense in the hyperreal world. The political subject is consumer of images. LARP politics, in addition to describing a political engagement that can be turned off and on like a tap, and hence why people change their politics so radically and so quixotically. Anyway, because you can turn it on and off like a tap. Describes an aesthetic quality belonging to the internet. Because the online image world is resolutely understood in opposition to the real world, LARP politics are regarded as bizarre and out of place when they rupture into the real. Like any simulation, though, a rupture into the real is inevitable, and I would argue the vital for the emergence of the declaration of LARP comes after farce. Otherwise, it's not LARP politics. There's no live action part if it doesn't erupt into the real. All right. Ruptures into the real. Baudrillard states that when a simulation confronts power, any distinction between the simulation and reality becomes useless to distinguish. His analogy of the simulated robbery describes the clash between the simulation and reality succinctly. Simulate a robbery in a large store. How to persuade security that it is simulated robbery? There's no objective difference. The gestures, signs are the same as for the real robbery, and the signs do not lean on one side or the other. They establish the order that they are always in the order of the real. The simulated robbery example precisely demonstrates the tension between hyperreality and reality that I argue is essential to our understanding of the absurdity of LARP politics. Like a fourth wall break, the order of the image intrudes into the order of the real, and this tension has been ruptured. Ruptured from that's when people get mad when you say that these politics are in the real world. They're not just online. That's why they're getting mad about it. Ruptures from the hyperreal simulation into the real are experienced palpably by society, which would otherwise maintain a cognitive dissonance between image and reality. Yep. These ruptures are often become historically or culturally significant events whose consequences vary from grave to traumatic to amusing and idiosyncratic. In any case, these ruptures for most people are disorienting, baffling, and hard to understand on their face value. To demonstrate what I mean when I talk about ruptures, I will return to the example of the Capitol Hill riot, where the political rhetoric born from the order of images confronts power, which can only function in the order of the real, aka power functions in the order of images too. That's what ideological state apparatuses are for. Yeah, I think this essay is very insightful and useful, but I think its use in the kind of binary distinctions of Baudrillard actually limits it, and I'm just gonna leave it at that, so you guys don't hear me gripe at Baudrillard the whole time. If we consider the Capitol Hill riot within this framework, actions based largely on an alternative reality, which distinctly online aesthetics were inevitably met with real and grave material consequences. We also saw this at the Charlottesville rally, with like some of the frog Nazis versus actual real hardened 3%ers. Yeah, different kinds of things going on there. Over 100 people were injured, 5 people died, property was damaged, arrests were made, and the event became considered a pivotal moment in contemporary American political history. Well, at least for the last 4 years. It might not in the long run. At the same time, the political goals of the riot were unclear, if they existed at all, and the aesthetics found within the riot became infamous for their overall weirdness. The aesthetic weirdness attached to this event is now widely understood. The QAnon shaman's appearance, the typically left-wing fist gesture on display by Senator Josh Hawley, the massive Gadsden flags and 2020 campaign flags, the gallows parodied towards the building, have all become iconic images sitting uncomfortably in the collective psyche of people impacted by U.S. politics. The gallows specifically provided an uncanny resemblance to Baudrillard's robbery example and encapsulated most of the LARP politics described. And we could talk about this on the left with all the guillotine memes. As an object whose utilitarian function is to hang someone, it is too structurally unsound to fulfill this role. Yep. Instead, it's an obstinately a feeder prop, and it serves as a metonym for the entire mob of rioters whose actions could only ever replicate a political coup in the realm of the imaginary. Yep. If it had been a real political coup, a lot more than 5 people would have died. Additionally, the ad hoc and on-site construction of the gallows represents the materialization of the chant "to hang Mac Pence," a chant which should largely be thrown around online and surprise nobody but becomes treated with much more gravity when it ruptures into the physical world. As such, the confrontation between simulation and power comes with the construction of the gallows becomes the cause for police investigation. If police were to discover who was responsible for its creation, much like in the example of the simulated robbery, how could any defendant claim that the gallows weren't in fact real? Massa, Moore, and Corvo also contextualized the Capitol Hill riot as delegated performance art, experimentally attributing to Trump himself the authorship over the event, and each participant the role of the performer. For Massa, Moore, and Corvo, it's performers' unpredictability and, I might add, ruptures into the real, which provide the aesthetic event an aura of realism, aka it could have had more real consequences, and it did have real consequences. Street art that is not recognized as art will get you shot. The sense that Capitol Hill riot can and ought to be considered considered art historically alongside its attributions to it as LARP politics served to reinforce the boundary between image and reality, becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. They've always been difficult to maintain. Always. The phrase LARP comes after farce has emerged as a compelling addendum to the Marxian adage, describing the sense that 20th century politics is itching for agitation and revolution, but fundamentally incapable of doing so. Yep. The impotence of the politics described as LARP stems from its location within the order of the image at the expense of genuine conviction and organization towards material change. I'm going to add, though, and maybe this is controversial because we're in the midst of protests, and I'm not saying this to condemn the current protesters, but protest politics as putting voice to the voiceless was already a simulation politics. It was a spectacular politics. All right. One that actually indicates a relationship of dependency. And I think that needs to be explored a lot more in regards to both left and right political agitation right now. Because a lot of people are like, it creates real change. It's how the PMC works. Well, it is. The illusion of that change is how the PMC, the ruling elites actually work. Yes. But it's an illusion. So when people come at me like, "Oh, protesting really is effective," look at South Africa. Yes, it changed the name, but all these people are thinking that Gramscian hegemony is the name of the game. And I think conservatives like that because it makes their cultural grievance politics seem more meaningful than it is, as opposed to a spectacular waste of time. But, lo and behold, these days, everyone's engaged in what could be conceived of as spectacular waste of time. But there's something about this LARP after farce that doesn't deal with the fact that the eruptions into the real can become just real. That's hinted by this article. And that's what I mean when I say, LARP it till it is the real. I'm not telling people that LARPing is good or bad. I mean, it's a thing. It's when people can no longer tell if their cognitive distance between self and persona is really there, then this distinction becomes a lot less meaningful. The impotence of the politics described as LARP stems from its location within the order of the image at the expense of genuine conviction and organization towards material change. This is where I disagree with him. I think the ruptures, what he calls the ruptures into the real, actually indicate that it's not actually that distinct. The Capitol Hill riot provides an almost perfect case of the study of LARP politics and hyperreality, but it's certainly not the only example. No, almost all protests and riots end up in that realm if they don't start there. Almost none of them actually achieve their goals. Sometimes they do, but it's rare. And even though people use the rare examples where they do work as the paradigmatic examples, they are actually the rarer examples. But that's true for revolutionary change too. So what are you going to do about it? That's a phenomenon which we described according to Baudrillard's notion of simulation. LARP politics inevitably faces the real at some point, and their clashes with the real will leave many scratching their heads. Yes, but revolutionary change almost always leaves many scratching their heads, and almost never is what people think it's going to be. There's one thing I do for studying history is almost no one really knows the consequences of what they're LARPing or what they're trying to bring about. And this is missed by people in hindsight, because in hindsight, all the prior real things seem inevitable, but that's actually just survivor's bias. Anyway, like and subscribe. Read this article. I find this Substack pretty interesting. So if you're into this kind of thing and want to work out these theoretical aesthetic things in a more rigorous way, engaging with this kind of stuff and material will really help you. And I'd like to thank Paul Sutherland for this article, even though I was critical on parts of it. I think overall it's way better than it is bad. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, find us on Patreon, read this article, go look up this Substack. Have a great day.